So let's look at these last two criticisms. So the fourth criticism that she offers up, directed specifically at this warrant proposal that Dershowitz makes, and specifically at its ability to increase visibility and accountability and to minimize torture, restricting it at most to necessary cases, is that she thinks that the power that Dershowitz attributes to a warrant system to provide documentation and accountability just isn't borne out by looking at similar warrant systems for other purposes that already exist. And finally, in her fifth criticism, she notes that having legal mechanisms that allow for torture run through this warrant process is going to undercut and render less effective mechanisms that already exist to document and hold accountable individuals and governments when they do engage in torture. So she tells us, look, if we're thinking about whether or not a warrant system is really going to reduce torture and provide coherent discrimination so that the good cases are the ones that get approved and the bad cases don't, and that raise visibility as well as accountability, then she says we ought to look and see how that's worked out in the case of issuing warrants for surveillance. And so she asks us to consider the track record of the Foreign Intelligence and Surveillance Act, FISA. And she notes that FISA has declined only one of the estimated 25 million requests for warrants that it received in the 25 years up to when she wrote this article, 2004. That doesn't look like very rigorous and discriminating judicial review. And though she didn't know this, but we knew it because of Edward Snowden, those warrants really didn't deter off the book warrantless wiretapping. That, in fact, despite this system, literally thousands and thousands of people in the United States were victims of warrantless wiretapping and intelligence surveillance and intelligence collection over the last few years, despite the existence of FISA. And so, if we extrapolate from the record of FISA to the record of a proposed warrant system for torture, it doesn't lead us to suppose that it's really going to raise visibility, accountability, and lower instances of torture. This isn't what's happened with wiretapping under FISA. And in fact, few of the people who have been wiretapped legally over the last 25 years are even aware that they were wiretapped. Many people never get informed, and in fact, there's not even a lot of good records that are accessible within the government to determine who has been wiretapped. And so warrants don't really make legal torture, or likely anyway, don't make legal torture more visible and accountable and less off the books if we're looking at it and thinking about it in terms of what's happened with surveillance under warrants. But she said there are organizations that have discovered torture, that have reported torture, made it visible, and have helped to make the people who tortured accountable. And those organizations, she says, are newspapers and international organizations like Amnesty International. And in fact, all the instances of torture that we talked about in the briefing and so on were exposed by newspaper reporters and Amnesty International and the International Red Cross. And so she suggests that if your goal is to expose torture and to hold torturers accountable, then instead of coming up with a warrant system where we have this incredibly small number of judges reviewing cases that are brought by an incredibly small number of legal people who then make judgments that are considered to be classified potentially forever. Those don't look like effective mechanisms to enhance the visibility of what's going on with torture. They don't look like particularly effective mechanisms to bring some wider accountability to the practice than the accountability brought to it by the few individuals that are involved in it. But these newspapers and international organizations have raised visibility in cases. They have helped to bring the torturers into the light and made accountable for what they'd done. And so she argues that if we do something like we did with surveillance, where we have these judicial reviews and we issue warrants, but everything's classified and it's done by this incredibly small number of individuals, then that's going to undermine the efficacy of newspapers and international organizations to find out about it. It's going to make it much more difficult for them to hold these people accountable and so on. So she ends her article with the following quote. She says, "Let us hope that his," meaning Mr. Dershowitz's, "former students and all other readers will see the errors in his reasoning and conclude that the best way to preserve the future from our enemies is to reaffirm each day the blanket prohibition on torture and to work with newspapers, human rights groups, and investigative bodies to document and hold those who torture accountable for their acts." Now, I think it's problematic to suggest in your conclusion that Dershowitz is really arguing against a blanket prohibition on torture. He's not really. What he's arguing is that, look, if governments insist on it, we ought to do it under the rubrics of institutional oversight. And I certainly don't think he's arguing that newspapers and human rights groups shouldn't be encouraged to investigate all these suspect cases, or that once exposed, these people shouldn't be held accountable. I don't think that those are things that it's appropriate to attribute to Dershowitz or to suppose that he includes in his argument. He explicitly says he doesn't have a normative stance in favor of torture. And so I think it's inappropriate to accuse him of advocating torture as a good thing. I think she may be right that his faith in judicial review is misplaced. But I'm not sure that even within her own article, she's consistent with this notion that we need to have a blanket prohibition on torture. And in these cases, people should do the right thing by, quote unquote, doing the wrong thing. So in this way, I find the conclusion of this article a little, confrontational and unconstructive.